The water was crystal clear when Sarah first saw the woman floating face down in her pool. But when she pulled her out, gasping and sputtering, the stranger didn't thank Hershey, demanded to know why Sarah had locked her out of her own backyard. What started as a simple trespassing issue spiraled into a neighborhood war that would expose buried secrets, shatter friendships, and reveal that sometimes the person you're trying to help is the very one plotting your destruction. Because when the whole neighborhood finally turned on her, they discovered the truth was more twisted than anyone could have imagined. Sarah Martinez had always prided herself on being the kind of neighbor who minded her own business. She'd worked double shifts as an ER nurse for 3 years to afford the modest ranch house on Maple Street, complete with the above-ground pool that had been her one splurge. The pool wasn't much a simple circular structure surrounded by a wooden deck she'd built herself, but it was hers. That's why she couldn't believe what she was seeing when she pulled into her driveway at 2:47 p.m. on a sweltering Tuesday in July. A woman was floating in her pool. Not drowning, not struggling, just casually floating on her back, arms spread wide, as if she owned the place. Sarah sat in her Honda Civic for a full 30 seconds, blinking hard, wondering if the heat was making her hallucinate. But no, the woman was still there, her bleached blonde hair fanned out like a halo around her head. Sarah grabbed her purse and stormed across the lawn, her scrubs still damp with sweat from her morning shift. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The woman slowly righted herself in the water, standing up with deliberate casualness. She was tall, probably mid-40s, with a kind of artificial tan that spoke of too much time and money spent on appearances. Her hot pink bikini was expensive, designer-looking, completely at odds with the modest neighborhood they were in. "Oh, hi there," the woman said, not a trace of embarrassment in her voice. She spoke with a slight southern drawl that somehow managed to sound both sweet and condescending. "You must be the new owner. I'm Brenda Hutchins. I live right over there." She gestured vaguely toward the row of houses across the street. Sarah's jaw dropped. "New owner, lady? I've lived here for 2 years. This is my pool, in my backyard behind my fence. You're trespassing." Brenda's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Oh, honey, I think there's been some confusion. You see, I've been using this pool for the past 5 years. The previous owner, Mr. Peterson, he was such a sweet old man. He always said I was welcome any time." She began wading toward the pool steps. "I just assumed the arrangement would continue." "Well, it doesn't," Sarah said, her voice rising. "I don't know what kind of arrangement you had with Mr. Peterson, but he's been dead for 3 years. I bought this house from his estate. That makes this my property, and you're trespassing." Brenda stepped out of the pool, water cascading off her artificially enhanced figure. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her life. "Now, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work something out. I mean, you're at work most of the time anyway, right? I only use it during the day when you're gone. No harm, no foul." Sarah felt her blood pressure spike. "Are you insane? You can't just use someone else's pool without permission. How are you even getting back here? My yard is fenced." "Oh, that?" Brenda laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on Sarah's nerves. "The gate latch has been broken for years. Slides right open if you know how to jiggle it just right. I keep meaning to mention it to someone. You keep meaning to." Sarah stopped herself, taking a deep breath. Getting into a screaming match with a clearly unstable woman wasn't going to solve anything. "Look, Mrs. Hutchins, Ms. Hutchins," Brenda corrected, her smile sharpening. "Recently divorced, which is why I need this little arrangement to continue. The pool at my apartment complex is always crowded with children, and I simply can't relax there." "I don't care what your situation is," Sarah said firmly. "You cannot use my pool. If you want to swim, join the community center or find somewhere else to live. But you're not swimming here anymore." Brenda's mask finally slipped. The sweet smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure venom. "You know what your problem is, sweetheart? You have no sense of community, no understanding of how things work in a real neighborhood. Mr. Peterson understood. He was a gentleman." "Mr. Peterson is dead," Sarah repeated, her patience finally snapping. "And even if he wasn't, he didn't have the right to give you permission to use property that wasn't his anymore. Now get your stuff and get out, or I'm calling the police." Brenda picked up a designer beach bag from one of Sarah's pool chairs Sarah had bought and paid for. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I know everyone. I'm involved in the community. You're just some outsider who thinks she can come in and change everything." "The only thing I'm changing is the lock on my gate," Sarah shot back. "And if I catch you back here again, I'm pressing charges." Brenda slung her bag over her shoulder and walked toward the gate, her movements deliberately slow and theatrical. At the gate, she turned back, her expression unreadable in the afternoon sun. "You know, Sarah, yes, I know your name, everyone. Talks you might want to be careful about making enemies so quickly. Small neighborhoods like this, reputation is everything. And once people start talking..." She let the threat hang in the air. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Sarah asked. But even as she said it, she felt a chill despite the heat. "It's supposed to be friendly advice," Brenda replied, her smile returning. "But I suppose we'll see how friendly this neighborhood really is, won't we?" She leapt through the gate, letting it swing shut behind her with a bang that echoed across the quiet afternoon. Sarah stood alone by her pool, watching the water settle back to stillness, and wondered why she felt like she'd just declared war. She walked over to examine the gate latch. It wasn't broken, it was perfectly functional, but when she looked closer, she could see fresh scratches around the metal, as if someone had been picking at it with a tool. Brenda hadn't been slipping through a broken latch. She'd been breaking in. Sarah's hand shook slightly as she tested the lock mechanism. It worked fine from the inside, but she could see how someone with the right tools could manipulate it from the outside. This hadn't been a casual arrangement with Mr. Peterson. This was deliberate, calculated trespassing. As she headed back toward her house, Sarah caught sight of movement in the window across the street. A curtain fell back into place quickly, but not before she glimpsed a familiar shock of blonde hair. Brenda was watching her, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that this was far from over. What she didn't know was that Brenda Hutchins had already picked up her phone and started making calls. By dinner time, half the neighborhood would know that the unfriendly newcomer on Maple Street had caused a scene over something as simple as sharing a pool. And by the end of the week, Sarah would discover that in small neighborhoods, truth was whatever the loudest voice decided it was. The war for Maple Street was about to begin, and Sarah had just fired the first shot without even knowing she was in a battle. Sarah discovered the first sign of Brenda's retaliation when she checked her mailbox Thursday morning. Tucked between a credit card offer and her electric bill was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "Dear neighbor, I hope you'll reconsider your harsh stance regarding community pool sharing. Some of us believe in the spirit of neighborly cooperation that makes Maple Street special." A concerned resident, no signature, no return address. But Sarah recognized the flowery script from the real estate documents she'd found in Mr. Peterson's old files, the same handwriting that had been on thank you cards scattered throughout his kitchen drawers. She crumpled the note and was heading back inside when her next-door neighbor, Margaret Chen, appeared at the property line with her watering. Margaret was in her 70s, a retired teacher who'd lived on Maple Street for 30 years. She'd been one of the few neighbors to actually welcome Sarah when she moved in. "Morning, Sarah," Margaret called out, but her usual warm smile seemed strained. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," Sarah replied, sensing something off in Margaret's tone. "How's your garden coming along?" Margaret's grip tightened on her watering can. "Oh, it's fine. Though I have to say, I was a bit surprised to hear about the ... situation with Brenda the other day." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What did you hear?" "Well," Margaret glanced around nervously. "Brenda stopped by yesterday evening. She was quite upset. Said you'd been very hostile about the pool arrangement she'd had with Mr. Peterson. She showed me some old photos of her and Harold by the pool from a few summers back." "Photos?" Sarah's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Yes, from his barbecues. You know Harold always threw those big 4th of July parties. Brenda was always there, helping out, bringing her famous potato salad." Margaret's expression grew more uncomfortable. She said, "You threatened to have her arrested just for swimming. That seems rather ... extreme." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Margaret, she was trespassing. She broke into my backyard and was using my pool without permission. I didn't threaten. I told her I'd call the police if she did it again." "Oh," Margaret's face fell. "Well, that's not quite How she told it? She said you'd been very rude, that you wouldn't even discuss a reasonable arrangement. She seemed genuinely hurt. A reasonable arrangement? Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. There is no arrangement to discuss. It's my property. She has no right to be there. Margaret stepped back slightly, clearly uncomfortable with Sarah's intensity. Of course, dear, it's just, well, Harold was such a generous man. He always said his pool was for the whole neighborhood to enjoy. Brenda's been having a difficult time since her divorce, and I suppose we all thought, double quotes, you all thought what? That you might continue Harold's tradition of sharing. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Brenda mentioned that you work such long hours. The pool just sits empty most of the time anyway. Sarah stared at her neighbor, processing the manipulation in every word. Margaret, did Mr. Peterson ever give you permission to use his pool? Well, no, but did he give anyone else on the street permission? Not exactly, but during the parties, those were parties. Events he hosted. That's completely different from someone breaking into my yard whenever they feel like it. Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. What else did Brenda tell you? Margaret looked away. She said, you were very unwelcoming. That you'd made it clear you weren't interested in being part of the community. She's worried about what kind of precedent this sets, you know? About the neighborhood spirit, Sarah repeated flatly. Yes, we've always looked out for each other here. When the Johnsons went through their rough patch, we all pitched in. When Mrs. Rodriguez was recovering from her surgery, we made sure she had meals and help with her yard. It's what makes this place special. Sarah felt trapped by the logic. How could she argue against community spirit without sounding selfish? But this wasn't about helping someone in need. This was about someone taking advantage of her property. I understand the importance of community, Margaret, but that doesn't mean I have to let strangers use my pool whenever they want. Strangers? Margaret looked genuinely confused. But Brenda's lived here for 15 years. She's on the HOA board, organizes the block parties, coordinates the neighborhood watch. She's hardly a stranger. She's a stranger to me, Sarah said, firmly, and living in the neighborhood doesn't give her squatter's rights to my backyard. Margaret's expression shifted, becoming cooler. I suppose that's your right. I just hope you'll think about what kind of neighbor you want to be. She turned and walked back toward her house, leaving Sarah standing alone with the distinct feeling that she'd just failed some kind of test. By Friday afternoon, Sarah understood the scope of Brenda's campaign. The mail carrier, usually chatty and friendly, barely made eye contact. The woman who jogged past her house every morning always waved suddenly found her phone fascinating whenever Sarah appeared. Even the teenager who mowed lawns in the neighborhood seemed to avoid her street entirely. The breaking point came when Sarah stopped at Tony's Market, the small grocery store 3 blocks from her house. She'd shopped there twice a week for 2 years, building the kind of casual friendship with Tony Salvatore that made living in a small community worthwhile. But when she walked in Friday evening, Tony's usual boisterous greeting was replaced by a curt nod. The other customers' neighbors, she recognized but didn't know, well stopped their conversations and stared. Sarah grabbed a basket and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched as she made her way through the narrow aisles. At the checkout counter, Tony rang up her items without his usual commentary about the weather or the neighborhood gossip. That'll be $47.83, he said, not meeting her eyes. Sarah handed him her credit card. Everything okay, Tony? He shrugged, running the card through the machine with more force than necessary. Sure, why wouldn't it be? You seem ... different. Tony glanced toward the other customers, then leaned closer. Look, Sarah, I don't want to get involved in neighborhood drama, but maybe you could have handled things better with Brenda. She's been shopping here for years, brings me business from all her friends. She's good people. Sarah felt her carefully. Maintained composure. Crack. What exactly did she tell you? That you kicked her out of your pool when she was just trying to maintain the arrangement she had with Harold. Said you were real nasty about it, threatened to call the cops over, nothing. Tony shook his head. Harold Peterson was a good man. He understood what community meant. Tony, she was trespassing. She broke into my yard. All I know is what I heard. Tony cut her off, handing her the receipt. And what I heard is that you're not interested in being neighborly. That's your choice. But actions have consequences. Sarah left the store with her groceries and a growing understanding that Brenda hadn't just threatened her. Reputations he'd already begun destroying. Every conversation, every interaction was being filtered through Brenda's version of events. The woman was systematically turning the entire neighborhood against her. That night, Sarah sat on her back deck, staring at the pool that had started this whole mess. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a mirror. It was beautiful, peaceful, everything she'd worked so hard to achieve. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hope you're enjoying your pool all by yourself. Loneliness is such a terrible thing." Sarah deleted the message, but the words lingered. She thought about Margaret's disappointment, Tony's coldness, the way her neighbors had begun treating her like a pariah. Was she wrong? Was she being unreasonable? Then she remembered the scratches on her gate latch, the calculated look in Brenda's eyes, the way she'd dismissed Sarah's ownership of her own property. This wasn't about community spirit or neighborhood cooperation. This was about power, and Brenda was used to getting her way. Sarah pulled up the contact information for a locksmith on her phone. If Brenda wanted to play games, she'd discover that Sarah Martinez hadn't survived nursing school, the death of both parents, and years of double shifts by backing down from bullies. But as she scheduled the appointment for Saturday morning, Sarah had no idea that Brenda's campaign was just getting started, or that the woman floating in her pool had been planning this war long before Sarah ever came home to find her there. The locksmith arrived at 8 a.m. sharp on Saturday, a grizzled man named Pete who took one look at Sarah's gate and whistled low. "Someone's been working on this latch," he said, running his fingers over the scratches Sarah had noticed. "See these? Marks. That's from lockpicks, probably a tension wrench. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You're saying someone picked my lock?" "More than once, by the looks of it. These scratches didn't happen overnight." Pete pulled out his tools. "You want me to upgrade the whole mechanism? I've got a deadbolt that'll stop anyone who doesn't have bolt cutters." "Do it," Sarah said immediately. "And can you install a security camera while you're at it?" Pete grinned. "Lady, I like your style. Someone giving you trouble." "You could say that." While Pete worked, Sarah decided to do some investigating of her own. She pulled out her laptop and started digging into public records, social media, anything she could find about Brenda Hutchins. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Brenda had been involved in 3 previous neighborhood disputes over the past 5 years. Each time the pattern was identical. She'd establish some kind of informal arrangement with a property owner, then claim rights to continue that arrangement even when circumstances changed. The first case involved an elderly man's garden shed where Brenda had been storing holiday decorations. When the man's family sold the house after his death, Brenda had sued the new owners for removing her property, claiming an oral contract with the deceased owner. The case was thrown out, but not before the new owners spent thousands in legal fees. The second dispute was over a parking space. Brenda had convinced a neighbor to let her park her second car in their driveway during the day. When the neighbor got tired of the arrangement and asked her to stop, Brenda claimed she'd been paying utilities and had tenant rights. Again, legal fees piled up before the case was dismissed. The third case never made it to court. But the online records showed a restraining order filed against Brenda by a family who claimed she'd been harassing them over access to their backyard vegetable garden. Sarah sat back in her chair, pieces clicking into place. Brenda hadn't just been using Mr. Peterson's pool casually. She'd been building a legal claim to it, documenting her presence with photos, probably collecting any evidence she could that might support some kind of adverse possession or easement claim. The old man's death had disrupted her timeline, but Sarah's purchase of the house had given her a new opportunity. The manipulation of the neighbors wasn't emotional warfare, it was strategic positioning. Brenda was building a case that Sarah was an unreasonable outsider, disrupting long-standing community arrangements. If she could isolate Sarah enough, she might even be able to claim that Sarah's interference with the traditional pool sharing was affecting the neighborhood's property values. "Cameras up and running," Pete announced, startling Sarah from her research. "Motion activated, connects to your phone. Anyone comes within 10 feet of that gate, you'll know about it." Sarah thanked him and paid the bill, her mind racing. She needed allies, and she needed them fast. But who could she trust when Brenda had already poisoned half the neighborhood against her? The answer came from an unexpected source. At 2 p.m., Sarah's doorbell rang. She opened it to find a woman about her age, with short dark hair and tired eyes, holding a casserole dish. "Hi," the woman said hesitantly. "I'm Lisa Rodriguez. I live 2 streets over on Oak. I heard about what happened with Brenda, and I wanted to talk to you." Sarah recognized the name Margaret had mentioned, Mrs. Rodriguez, when talking about the neighborhood's spirit of helping each other. "Please, come in." Lisa set the casserole on Sarah's kitchen counter and turned to face her. "I need to tell you something about Brenda Hutchins, and you're not going to like it. I'm listening." 3 years ago, when I was recovering from cancer surgery, Brenda volunteered to help with my yard work. She was so helpful, so sweet. She said she just wanted to contribute to the community. Lisa's jaw tightened. What she actually did was take pictures of herself in my garden, document every time she helped, keep receipts for plants she bought. Sarah felt a chill. Why? When I was finally recovered and back on my feet, I thanked her and said I could handle my own yard again. That's when she presented me with a bill for over $2,000. Said she'd been providing landscaping services and expected compensation. What did you do? I refused to pay, obviously. That's when the harassment started. Phone calls at all hours, emails, social media posts about how I was an ungrateful neighbor who took advantage of people's kindness. Lisa's voice shook with anger. She filed complaints with the HOA, saying my yard was bringing down property values. She tried to get me fined for code violations that didn't exist. Sarah poured 2 glasses of water, her hands trembling slightly. How did it end? My husband's a lawyer. He sent her a cease and desist letter, threatened to file harassment charges. She backed off, but not before she'd turned half the neighborhood against me. People I'd known for years suddenly thought I was some kind of con artist who manipulated a cancer survivor into doing free work. That's horrible. The worst part? She's done it to others. The Hendersons on Pine Street, the elderly couple on Elm, always the same pattern. She volunteers to help, documents everything, then demands payment or claims some kind of ongoing right to the property. Lisa leaned forward. Sarah, she's not just some entitled neighbor. She's a predator who targets people she thinks are vulnerable. Sarah thought about the photos Brenda had shown Margaret, the careful documentation of her presence at Mr. Peterson's parties. She thought, I'd be vulnerable because I'm new to the neighborhood. Exactly. And when you stood up to her, she switched to plan bisylate you socially until you're desperate enough to make a deal just to get your life back. So what do? Lisa smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. You fight back, and you don't fight alone. There are more of us than you think, people who've seen through Brenda's act. People who are tired of walking on eggshells around her. We've just been waiting for someone brave enough to stand up first. That evening, Sarah's new security camera caught its first visitor. At 9:47 p.m., a figure approached her gate, tested the new lock, then spent several minutes examining the camera. The motion sensor light illuminated Brenda's face clearly as she stared directly into the lens, her expression cold and calculating. She didn't try to break in. She just stood there for a full 5 minutes, making sure Sarah would see the recording, making sure the message was clear. I know you're watching. I'm not afraid this isn't over. But what Brenda didn't know was that Sarah had spent the afternoon building her own network. Lisa had introduced her to 4 other neighbors who'd had run-ins with Brenda. By Sunday morning, they'd have a plan of their own. The war for Maple Street was about to shift, and this time, Sarah wouldn't be fighting alone. She'd learned that sometimes the best defense against a predator was to make sure they couldn't isolate their prey. Brenda Hutchins was about to discover that her reign of terror had finally met its match. Sunday morning brought Sarah's first taste of real solidarity in months, who'd brought a thick folder of legal documents across from them. Elderly Frank Henderson clutched his wife Marie's hand while she recounted their own nightmare with Brenda. She volunteered to check on our house while we were visiting our son in Phoenix, said she'd water plants, bring in mail, make sure everything looked lived in. When we got back, she'd changed our locks. Frank's weathered hands shook with barely contained rage, claimed we owed her for house-sitting services, had receipts for groceries she'd bought, utilities she said she'd paid, even charged us for her time, over $3,000. How did she even get away with changing your locks? Sarah asked. David Rodriguez answered, his lawyer's training evident in his measured tone. She told the locksmith she was their daughter, that they'd asked her to upgrade security while they were away, had photos of herself in their house, keys they'd given her, even forged a note authorizing the work. Tom Chunmargaret's son, who'd driven down from Sacramento after his mother called him in, tears pulled out his tablet. I've been researching property law all night. What she's doing isn't just harassment tease, a form of real estate fraud. She targets people she thinks won't fight back, establishes some kind of presence on their property, then claims legal rights based on adverse possession or implied contracts. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and horror. So I was right, too. Fight back. You were right, and you were smart, Lisa said firmly. Not anymore, Tom said, his young face set with determination. I've documented everything. The pattern is too clear to ignore. Think we can do better than that, David said, opening his folder. I've been pulling court records. Brenda's been involved in over a dozen civil disputes in the past 7 years, always as the plaintiff, always claiming someone owes her money, or has violated her property rights. She's never lost because people settle rather than fight, but she's never actually won in court either. Tom leaned forward. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time someone called her bluff. Sarah, she's going to escalate. That little performance at your gate last night was just the beginning. She'll try to claim you're harassing her, maybe file for a restraining order to flip the narrative. But if we're ready for her, we turn the tables, Sarah finished, understanding dawning. Make her the defendant instead of the plaintiff. For criminal harassment, stalking, maybe even organized fraud. Frank Henderson's voice was stronger than it had been all morning. What do you need from us? For the next 2 hours, they planned their strategy. David would file a restraining order against Brenda on behalf of all 5 families, documenting her pattern of harassment and property violations. Tom would present their evidence to the district attorney's office, pushing for criminal charges. Sarah would continue documenting every interaction, every violation captured by her camera. Most importantly, they would stop hiding. Brenda's power came from isolation, from making her victims feel alone and helpless. But when the whole neighborhood saw 5 families standing together, when they understood the true nature of what had been happening, the social dynamics would shift dramatically. As the group prepared to leave, Sarah's security camera alert chimed on her phone. A man in an expensive suit walked beside her, carrying a briefcase and what looked like surveying equipment. She's brought reinforcements, Lisa observed, looking over Sarah's shoulder at the phone screen. Tom's expression darkened. She's escalating faster than we expected. They watched through the app as Brenda pointed at various parts of Sarah's yard while the man took notes and photos. The lawyer, if that's what he was, spent several minutes examining the fence line, the gate, and the pool area. Brenda gestured dramatically, clearly spinning some version of events that painted her as the victim. She's building a case, David said grimly, probably claiming you've been harassing her, interfering with her legal right to access the property. Sarah felt her newfound confidence waver. What if she actually has some kind of legal claim? What if there really was an arrangement with Mr. Peterson that gives her rights? There's no easement, no written agreement, nothing that would give her any legal standing. Whatever arrangement she had was purely social, and it died with him. The man with the briefcase was now taking measurements, documenting distances between the fence and various landmarks. Brenda stood watching, her arms crossed, occasionally pointing at something and speaking animatedly. They're preparing to file something, Tom observed. Probably a civil suit, claiming interference with her property rights, maybe defamation if she's feeling ambitious. Let her, Sarah said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. I'm done being afraid of her legal threats. If she wants to take this to court, we'll be ready. The lawyer finished his documentation and handed Brenda what looked like official papers. She glanced toward Sarah's house, smiled directly at the camera, and held up the documents so Sarah could see them clearly. Then she did something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Within seconds, Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. The message was simple. See you in court, neighbor. Hope you can afford better lawyers than the Hendersons could. The implication was, Claire Brenda knew about their meeting, knew about their alliance, and was already planning her counterattack. Somehow, she'd been watching them just as carefully as they'd been watching her. As the group left Sarah's house, Each family carrying copies of David's legal strategy and Tom's research, Sarah felt the weight of what they were up against. Brenda wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was an organized predator with resources, connections, and years of experience manipulating the system. That night, Sarah sat by her pool again, but this time she wasn't alone with her thoughts. Her phone buzzed constantly with supportive texts from her new allies, updates on their progress, and words of encouragement. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she might actually win. But victory was still far from certain. Brenda had just raised the stakes to a level that would test not just Sarah's resolve, but her finances, her reputation, and her faith in the justice system itself. The woman who'd once floated casually in Sarah's pool had just declared total war, fighting against. The first bomb dropped at 7 a.m. Monday morning when Sarah found legal papers taped to her front door. Brenda was suing her for $75,000 in damages, claiming harassment, defamation, and interference with her contractual rights to pool access. The lawsuit painted Sarah as an unstable newcomer who'd violently threatened a longtime community member over a simple misunderstanding. The second bomb exploded 2 hours later when Tom Chen called, his voice tight with excitement and rage. "Sarah, you need to get down to the county recorder's office right now and bring David Rodriguez if you can. We found something." She met them at the courthouse, where Tom had spent the morning digging through property records with the obsessive focus of a man who'd discovered his elderly mother had been manipulated by a predator. "Look at this," Tom said, spreading documents across a conference table. "I've been tracing all of Brenda's legal disputes, trying to find a pattern, but I found something else entirely." David Rodriguez leaned over the papers, his lawyer's eyes quickly scanning the dense legal text. "What am I looking at? Property transfers, all involving elderly residents who died within the past 5 years. Harold Peterson, Martha Williamson, on Pine Street, George Kowalski, over on Oak." Tom's finger traced across the documents. "Look at the dates." Sarah studied the paperwork. "I don't understand. These are just normal estate sales." "Look closer," Tom insisted. "Look at who handled the estate sales. The same attorney, each time Richard Blackwood. And look at this." He pulled out another set of documents, Blackwood's office address. Sarah's blood chilled as she read the address. It was the same building where Brenda's lawyer had his practice. The same man who'd been measuring her yard yesterday. "They're working together," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brenda identifies vulnerable elderly residents, establishes relationships with them, documents her presence on their property. When they die, Blackwood handles the estate hand, makes sure any evidence of Brenda's arrangements disappears." Tom nodded grimly. "But here's the thing, they got sloppy with Harold Peterson. Look at this." He produced a thick folder. "I found Harold's personal papers in his daughter's garage. She lives in Oregon. Never went through everything before the estate sale. She let me take whatever I wanted." Sarah opened the folder to find dozens of photographs, letters, and receipts. But it was the handwritten journal that made her hands. Sheikh Harold Peterson's final entries, dated just weeks before his death, painted a picture of a man under siege. Brenda had been pressuring him to formalize their arrangement in writing. She'd brought lawyers to his house claiming she needed documentation for insurance purposes. When Harold refused, she'd begun a campaign of subtle harassment, small acts of vandalism blamed on teenagers, utility bills that mysteriously went unpaid despite his meticulous record-keeping, helpful visits that left him exhausted and confused. She was trying to get him to change his will, Sarah said, reading the trembling handwriting. He wrote that she kept talking about how much the pool meant to her, how devastating it would be if she lost access to it. David's face was pale. "This is elder abuse. Financial exploitation, if we can prove she was doing this systematically." "We can," Tom said, pulling out more documents. "Martha Williamson's family in Denver sent me her papers too. Same pattern, same pressure tactics, same mysterious problems that Brenda always seemed to know about before anyone else." Sarah felt pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The broken gate latch. She told me it had been broken for years, but it wasn't broken she'd been picking it. Harold probably never even knew she was breaking in. And when he died before she could manipulate him into changing his will, she just continued using the property, David added. Probably figured she could establish an adverse possession claim if she maintained access long enough. Tom's phone buzzed with a text. His face darkened as he read it. My mother just got served with papers. Brenda's claiming mom defamed her. By spreading false rumors about her character, she's suing for emotional distress. Sarah slammed her hand on the table. This has to stop. We have enough evidence to bury her, so why are we still playing defense? David was already on his phone. Because we're not anymore, I'm calling the district attorney's office, and I'm calling the state attorney general's office. If Brenda and Blackwood have been running an elder abuse scam, this is way bigger than neighborhood disputes. While David made his calls, Sarah and Tom continued reading Harold Peterson's journal. The final entry, dated 3 days before his death, was a single line that broke Sarah's heart. I don't understand what's happening to me. Everything was so simple before she started helping. An hour later, David returned with news that changed everything. The state has been investigating Richard Blackwood for estate fraud, he announced. They've been building a case for 2 years, but they needed more evidence. What we found today could be the missing piece. Sarah felt a surge of hope. What happens now? Now we go on offense. The district attorney is sending investigators to interview all of Brenda's victims. They're going to search her property, examine her financial records, and review every estate case Blackwood has handled. David's smile was grim with satisfaction. And they're putting a freeze on any civil litigation she's filed until the criminal investigation is complete. Tom's phone rang. It was his mother calling from her kitchen window. Tommy, Margaret Chen's voice was shaky but excited. There are police cars at Brenda's house, lots of them, and they're carrying boxes out of her garage. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For weeks, she'd felt like she was fighting a shadow, an enemy who seemed to have unlimited resources and no vulnerabilities. But Brenda's greatest strength, her systematic approach to exploitation, had also been her weakness. She'd left a paper trail that led straight back to her. As they drove back to Maple Street, Sarah saw the neighborhood transformed. Police cars lined the street. Investigators moved in and out of Brenda's house, and neighbors gathered in small groups, their faces a mixture of shock and vindication. Margaret Chen stood in her front yard, tears streaming down her face as she watched the investigators work. When she saw Sarah, she ran across the street. I'm so sorry, Margaret sobbed, embracing Sarah fiercely. I should have listened to you. I should have known. You couldn't have known, Sarah said gently. She was very good at what she did, but you saw through her. From the very beginning, you saw who she really was. Sarah looked at Brenda's house, where investigators were loading boxes of evidence into unmarked vans. Through the front window, she could see a figure standing motionless, watching the destruction of her carefully constructed life. Brenda Hutchins had finally met her match. But it hadn't been Sarah's legal challenges or neighborhood coalition that brought her down. It had been her own greed, her inability to leave well enough alone, and the meticulous records she'd kept of her own criminal activity. As the sun set over Maple Street, Sarah realized that sometimes justice came not from fighting harder, but from fighting smarter, and sometimes the best way to defeat a predator was simply to shine a light bright enough to expose what they'd been doing in the shadows. But the story wasn't over yet, because in that darkened window, Brenda Hutchins was making one final plan, and she still had one last card to play. Sarah woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. She grabbed her phone and checked the security camera app, her heart hammering as the motion-activated lights illuminated her backyard. What she saw made her blood freeze. Brenda stood by. The pool, no longer the carefully composed manipulator who'd terrorized the neighborhood for months. Her blonde hair hung in tangles, her designer clothes were wrinkled and stained, and in her hands she held a crowbar that she'd apparently used to shatter Sarah's patio door. But it was Brenda's eyes that truly terrified Sarah Wilde, desperate and completely unhinged. Sarah dialed 911 with shaking fingers, while keeping the camera feed open. There's someone breaking into my backyard. She has a weapon. Ma'am, units are already en route, the dispatcher said. We've had this address flagged for priority response. Stay inside and away from windows. On screen, Brenda was talking to herself, pacing around the pool like a caged animal. Sarah could see her lips moving but couldn't make out words through the app's audio feed. Then Brenda stopped, looked directly at the camera, and smiled the same calculating expression she'd worn that first day, but twisted now with madness. Brenda pulled out her phone and typed something. Seconds later, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. "Come outside. We need to finish this. Just you and me." Sarah's hands trembled as she typed back. "The police are coming. It's over, Brenda." The response came immediately. "Nothing's over until I say it's over. This is my neighborhood, my pool, my life you destroyed." Through the camera, Sarah watched Brenda raise the crowbar above her head and bring it down on one of Sarah's pool chairs, splintering the plastic. Then she turned toward the pool itself. "You took everything from me," came another text. "My reputation, my home, my future. So I'm taking everything from you." Brenda raised the crowbar again, this time aiming for the pool's filtration system. Sarah realized with horror what she was planning if she couldn't have the pool. She'd destroy it completely. That's when Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She unlocked her front door and stepped outside. "Brenda," she called across the yard. "Stop!" Brenda froze, the crowbar suspended mid-swing. Slowly, she turned toward Sarah, and for a moment, the desperate madness in her eyes cleared. "You came," Brenda said, her voice almost childlike. "I knew you would. You're not like the others. You will actually fight back." Sarah stepped closer, keeping her hands visible and her voice calm. "You're right, I do fight back. But this isn't fighting, Brenda. This is just destruction." "They arrested me," Brenda said, the crowbar wavering in her. "Perp walked me out of my own home like a common criminal. 20 years in this neighborhood, and they treated me like garbage." "Because you were hurting people," Sarah said gently. "Harold Peterson, the Hendersons, all those families. You were stealing from them." Brenda's face contorted with rage. "I wasn't stealing. I was helping. They were lonely, confused. They needed someone to take care of things. I gave them purpose. You gave them fear," Sarah replied. "Harold died terrified and confused because of what you put him through. Harold loved me." Brenda screamed, raising the crowbar again. "He said I was like the daughter he never had. He wanted me to have the pool. Then why didn't he put it in his will?" The question hung in the air like a physical blow. Brenda's face crumpled, and for the first time, Sarah saw past the manipulation and desperation to the broken person underneath. "He was going to," Brenda whispered. "He promised he would. But then he got sick, and his real daughter started calling all the time, and suddenly I was just ... just the neighbor again. Not family, not special, just someone who cleaned his pool." Sarah felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. "So you decided to take what you thought you deserved." "I worked for it," Brenda's voice cracked. 20 years of being the perfect neighbor, helping everyone, organizing everything, making this place special. And what do I get? A divorce that takes half my money, an apartment with a view of the dumpster, and everyone treating me like I'm nobody." The sound of sirens grew louder, but Sarah didn't look away from Brenda's face. She was beginning to understand the twisted logic that had driven everything a desperate need to matter, to belong, to be irreplaceable in a world that had made her feel disposable. "You do matter, Brenda," Sarah said quietly, "but not because of what you can take from people. You matter because you're a human being who deserves respect and kindness. But you can't force those things. You can't steal them." Brenda lowered the crowbar slightly. "Easy for you to say. You're young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. I'm 52 years old, divorced, unemployed, and now I'm going to be a convicted felon. What kind of life is that? The kind you build one day at a time," Sarah said. "The kind where you take responsibility for the damage you've done and try to make it right." Police cars rounded the corner, their red and blue lights painting the quiet neighborhood in harsh, alternating colors. Brenda looked at them, then back at Sarah, her grip tightening on the crowbar. "They're going to put me in prison," she said. "Probably," Sarah agreed. "But, Brenda, it doesn't have to end there. You can get help. You can change. You can find a way to contribute something positive instead of just taking from others." Brenda stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something shift in her expression, a crack in the armor of desperation and rage that had been driving her actions. "You really believe that?" Brenda asked. "I do," Sarah said. "I've seen people come back from worse things, but first, you have to stop running and face what you've done." The police were getting out of their cars now, moving into position. Sarah could hear officers talking quietly into their radios, planning their approach. Brenda looked at the crowbar in her hands as if seeing it for the first time. Then, slowly, she set it down on the pool deck and stepped away from it. "Brenda Hutchins," came a voice over a police loudspeaker. "Put your hands where we can see them and walk slowly toward the front of the house." Brenda looked at Sarah one last time. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Sarah believed she meant it. As the police led Brenda away in handcuffs, neighbors emerged from their houses to watch the final act of the drama that had consumed Maple Street for months. Margaret Chen stood with her son Tom, tears streaming down her face. They held each other tightly, finally free from the fear that had dominated their golden years. Lisa Rodriguez gave Sarah a thumbs up from across the street. But it was the text message Sarah received the next morning that brought her the most satisfaction. It was from the district attorney's office, informing her that Brenda's cooperation in the investigation had led to the arrest of Richard Blackwood and the recovery of over $200,000 in stolen assets from elderly victims. 3 weeks later, Sarah hosted the first annual Maple Street Block Party in 5 years. The entire neighborhood turned out, bringing food, games, and genuine laughter to a street that had been held hostage by one woman's desperate need for control. As Sarah floated in her pool that evening, watching her neighbor's children play in her backyard with their parents' grateful permission, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this point. She'd moved to Maple Street looking for peace and privacy. But what she'd found instead was something far more valuable of community worth fighting for. And sometimes she realized the best way to protect what you love is simply to refuse to let anyone take it away from you, one small act of courage at a time.